Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today for the webinar, How to Apply OBC, Part 11 to Your Projects. My name's Claire. I'm the Deputy Registrar at the OAA. We will begin today's webinar by acknowledging the land on which we're meeting and calling in from. For millennia, the place we call Ontario has been inhabited by Indigenous peoples and nations who have been stewards of the land and are deeply connected to its rich cultural and natural landscape. We would like to invite you, in a moment of reflection, to acknowledge our shared responsibility to address past and present injustices and provide space for Indigenous knowledge and worldviews that shape the architectural landscape of Turtle Island. Before we begin today's webinar, I just would like to make a few short announcements to have a professional and effective webinar experience. Do know that today's session is being recorded for quality and educational purposes. To maintain a stable internet connection, we have muted all participant microphones and disabled video feeds. We do encourage you to participate through our Q&A window. I know there'll be lots of questions during the presentation for Megan, but just note there is a button at the bottom of your screen. That is how you will be able to submit the questions. You can submit them at any time throughout the presentation. I would just ask that you remember that we will be using a designated Q&A period at the end of the presentation to answer those questions. And for those of you on the call today who are seeking continuing education, learning hours, do know that your attendance is crucial. You will need to attend at least 80% of the webinar to be accredited those hours to your transcript. And just allow us a few weeks to process and report those hours. Also know for accessibility, we have automated closed captioning services available in multiple languages to accommodate the needs of our diverse audience. And lastly, note that our presenter does not provide insurance, legal, or practice advice, and the OAA does not bear responsibility for errors or omissions in discussions during the webinar. And with all that said, I am very excited to introduce today's speaker, Megan Nicoletti.
Thanks, Claire. Hello, everyone. Welcome. I believe I probably met a few of you over the course of my career and perhaps in past presentations, but thank you for taking the time to join me today as I present to you on Part 11. Part 11 is one of my favorite topics, but it is a comprehensive presentation. There is a lot of content in here, and I'm hoping to give you some clarity because I feel like from an architect's perspective, it is one of the most confusing sections of the building code, but it shouldn't be. Once, hopefully after this presentation, you'll have a better understanding and you'll grow to love it like I will. So let's jump right in. So today I'm going to talk to you about general application. Before I get into the weeds of the building code, I need you to understand the application of the building code, especially when we get into kind of renovations, extensive renovations, application of the building code in terms of whether it's grandfathering. Grandfathering is often a term we hear associated with Part 11. So I want to provide some clarity on that. And then I'm going to get into essentially the differences between a basic renovation and an extensive renovation. And then we'll speak to the performance level and compensating construction, which is really kind of the meat of Part 11. And I'll walk you through how you would do a building evaluation. And I'll speak to the compliance alternatives, which are otherwise known as our grandfathering clauses. And then I've left a little bit of room at the end to speak about Part 11 OBC matrices. And like Claire had said, we'll have some Q&A at the end. So please feel free to input your questions into the chat feature as we go through. And hopefully, if we have enough time, we can get through them all. So let's jump right in here. So the first thing I want you to understand is the difference between the Ontario Building Code and the Ontario Fire Code. So the Ontario Building Code is applicable to construction. You should all be quite familiar with this document. And when I say document, I say that lightly. The OBC is quite bulky with its 2-binder series, but the OBC is applicable to construction. So I want you to think of this as your design tool. Okay, if you want to know how to construct a building or how to design a building, you're going to refer to the Ontario Building Code. You are building a building with the building code. That being said, the Ontario Building Code is not retroactive. in the sense that it doesn't apply to a building after you've gotten your occupancy permit. So the premise is you use the Ontario Building Code to design your project. And if you follow the building code, you will get a permit, you will get an occupancy permit, and then you can put that big binder right back on the bookcase and you don't need to worry about it anymore because it's deemed that your building was built safely and therefore it should last for the duration that's expected. However, we do recognize that owners and operators may not quite understand what your intentions were and that, oh, that was a fire-rated wall assembly? Oops. And so this is where the Ontario Fire Code comes into play. So the Ontario Fire Code is your maintenance document, okay? This document is retroactive. So this applies every single day. And this is your assurance that the building that you safely designed is maintained for the lifespan of that building. So all those protective systems that you put in place are maintained. So this is your retroactive document. It is enforced by local fire services. And if they find any deviation, so if you had specified a certain life safety system and it wasn't maintained by the building owner or operator, then that person who occupies that building or that owner of that building could receive a notice of violation or an order to comply that is retroactive and forces them to repair that system that was either damaged or renovated without a permit or removed, okay? So I always want you to remember that the Ontario Building Code is only applicable when you're touching something, and that kind of frames the whole groundwork for this presentation. Ontario Building Code is only applicable to items that you touch. If you don't touch it, it's not retroactive and you're not obligated to upgrade it. Whereas the Fire Code, the Ontario Fire Code, is your retroactive document and it's your maintenance document, okay? I use the acronyms OBC for Ontario Building Code and OFC for Ontario Fire Code. So just to keep everybody on their toes, we're going to jump right into one of our polls. I'm going to lay out a situation and then I'm going to pose this poll to you and let you select here. So the scenario is you have a wall that you have spec'd and it's a concrete wall. Concrete has an inherent fire resistance rating. Let's say for this case, it's 1 hour. You've designed it, you've gotten permit, this is a demising wall, you're good to go. Then the owner and operator comes along and they drill a hole through this wall. This is in contravention of which code? OBC, OFC, or KFC? So we'll give everybody about 15 seconds to make a vote here and then we'll pull those results. We have damaged a wall. Okay, we'll have about 5 more seconds. 3, 2, get your votes in, 1. Let's see those results. Okay, so we have 37% say OBC, 60% say OFC, and 3% say KFC. Thank you for those who like your Kentucky Fried Chicken. I always wondered to see if we could get any votes for that. The correct answer is OFC. So you have designed this wall and you've said that it's a solid wall, and that's the requirement of the building code. So you got your occupancy permit and this is a solid wall. However, the owner and the operator came along and they put a hole in it. Well, now smoke and fire could potentially get through that wall and they've damaged that fire separation that you designed, and you're well off the project. This could be 5 years down the road. So this is an Ontario Fire Code requirement that you have to maintain this wall. So this owner will be issued an order to comply or a notice of violation saying, uh-oh, you put a hole in that wall, you've damaged it. We need you to repair it and you have 30 days to do so. Okay, so just remember, maintenance. If the owner or operator come along and put a hole in your wall, well, what's going to ensure that that wall remains as you designed it? That would be the Ontario Fire Code. Okay, so now that we understand the difference between the OBC and the OFC, let's jump into the OBC, which is kind of the premise of this conversation. And I'm going to speak to the different parts of the OBC. I know we're focusing on part 11, but I do need everybody to be aware of also part 10, okay? So part 10 does come into play for existing buildings and renovations. And I want you to understand the difference between part 10, part 11. So part 10 is titled Change of Use. This is applicable when you are not undertaking construction, but you're affecting the building by changing its use. I feel like this is best described in an example. So A client, say, purchases a large open warehouse space. This building was designed as an industrial facility, F2 or an F3. And they decide, you know what, we don't need to do any construction. We're just going to plunk a whole bunch of office desks into this space, maybe some couches against the wall. We've got a little kitchenette in the corner. We don't need to do construction, so we don't need to apply for a building permit, right? Well, however, that building was designed for an industrial application. It's not designed for an office occupancy. And so there's certain things that would have to be considered to make sure that this space is accommodating for an office occupancy. So there are things we have to look at. We might have more people in an office than we would have had in an industrial space. So maybe we want to check and make sure there's enough washrooms, right? And we maybe have different time frames. Industrial buildings typically operate on a shift system, whereas in an office, they're there on a more regular schedule. So those things have to be evaluated. So even though we're not doing construction, the building code is enforced if we change the use of a space. And essentially, if that building was not designed to accommodate that occupancy, well, then we have to evaluate it and make sure that we're not making it worse. Okay? So remember, Part 11 is when there's no construction, just a change of use. Part 11 comes into play when we are doing construction, okay? And I should caveat, Part 10 still requires a building permit. So anytime you change use of a space, you still have to apply for building permit, even though you're actually not doing construction, but you have to prove to the city that somebody with knowledge has evaluated this and upgrades to the building are not required or are required under Part 10. Jumping over to Part 11, Part 11 is applicable when we do construction. So say we have that same kind of warehouse space and the office is moving into it, but they're going to be constructing partitions, new washrooms. They want to designate a cafeteria space. So we are doing construction. So that could be a change of use potentially if we do have that office and warehouse occupancy type. So Part 11 does cover a change of use, but it also covers change of use with construction or circumstances where we don't have a change of use, but we're just renovating an existing building. So say it's a warehouse and you're renovating it to be a different type of warehouse. That would be under Part 11, okay? There are some rules to applying Part 11. One of them being that the building must be at least 5 years old, okay? In order to use Part 11, the building must be at least 5 years old. And the reason behind that is the code deems that if the building is newer than 5 years, then it should have been designed as that tenant space in the first place. So you would, construction process from permit to occupancy can sometimes take 5 years. So we don't want to have that loophole where an owner may say, oh, you know what, I'm going to eventually make this warehouse an office space, but it's easier to get permit and zoning for a warehouse space. So we're going to apply for permit, but then we're going to apply Part 11 and grandfather everything when it comes in as an office and we do an amendment later on. So that's that loophole that the building code is trying to capture by saying you can only apply Part 11 if your building is older than 5 years. Okay. The other requirement is if you design your building under Part 11, you must design it to all other parts. This is governing the construction, which I'm going to get into very shortly under basic and extensive renovations, which is our next topic. And we get posed this question quite often, and I should probably have done another poll here where I want to ask, how many of you have filled out an OBC matrix and hit basic and had the city come back to you and say, that's extensive? So I want to be clear on the difference between basic and extensive renovations. And my kind of rule of thumb on this is basic renovations don't require a permit, and these are your aesthetic improvements, okay? You're retiling a washroom. You are painting a room. You are taking a door frame off and putting in a new door frame, or sorry, door panel, not door frame. Your door is damaged. You've got a notice of violation. Someone punctured a hole in your wall. So you're just going to repair that. Those are all basic renovations that don't warrant necessarily a permit application. Whereas an extensive renovation, and if you go to the city, some municipal websites, they often list when you need a building permit. And these are typically following when you need, when you're doing construction, for example, you're building a wall. A lot of people are like, well, the wall's just a partition wall. It doesn't really affect anything. It doesn't have a fire resistance rating, or it's not constructed as a fire separation. So we shouldn't need a permit, right? But there's things that have to be considered and someone without knowledge may not be aware of. For example, if a builder was just building this and there was no architect on the team, they may not have the knowledge to know that, oh, by putting that wall there, they're affecting travel distance. People now have to walk around that wall. So has anybody looked to see if they've affected the travel distance of that space to a point where now it's no longer safe? Okay, so those are the evaluations that the city is going to want to see under an extensive renovation. Okay. One of the hot topics for Part 11 that come up quite a lot is barrier-free. And there's a specific requirement under extensive renovations under OBC 11332 that I want to really get into the weeds on and go through because I want you to be clear. As a code consultant, word choices are key. We really look at every word. And for any of you who have written your exams, the and, or, except as, those are key words that you really need to tune in on. And under this clause, under 11332, this requirement is when you apply barrier-free requirements, so like all your 3.8 requirements, when you're going to enforce them on your project. Because we get a lot of questions that come in and say, okay, well, I'm doing renovations to this space, but I don't want to touch it because it's not currently barrier-free, and I don't know when I need to make it barrier-free. And if by adding this door, do I need to now renovate my suite and put in a universal washroom? And so there's a specific clause under here that speaks to that, and this is under sentence 3 of 11332. And I want you to be aware of that and conjunction. So there are 3 bullets in this requirement, and they are joined by an and conjunction, which means you need to meet every single one of these requirements in order for this sentence to be applied. I know the code does not read this well, so I'm trying to put it in layman's terms for you. So what it's saying is, if you meet every one of these bullets, you need to design that suite to be barrier-free. Okay? You have to meet every bullet. So let's think to this. New interior walls or floors are installed. Sure, we're doing renovations to this space. So yes, we are doing partition installation. So yes, check for the first bullet. Second one, our suite has an area greater than 300 meters squared. Okay, let's say our suite is 600 meters squared and we're building new walls. Check. Now we go to the third bullet. And this, in layman's terms here, if that suite is accessible. Okay, so if the entrance door from the street or the building is served by an elevator, if you can physically get someone in a wheelchair to your suite, then you would check that third bullet. Okay, but if you have an existing building and you have 2 or 3 stair risers at the exterior entrance door, such that someone in a wheelchair could not physically compensate for that barrier and get into the suite, then you would not be considered to renovate that entrance. This assumes that the entrance door is not within your scope of renovations, and therefore we do not need to design the suite to be barrier-free. We do not comply with that third bullet, and because it's an and conjunction, the code says you don't have to worry about barrier-free for this suite. Okay, so just note that and conjunction. However, the code does recognize that not everybody requires the use of a wheelchair, and there's other people that can be accommodated, even though we have this barrier at our front entrance. So we call these kind of our limited barrier-free requirements. And these include interior walking surfaces, washrooms, tactile signage, doors, assistive listening devices, counters for telephones, and drinking fountains. So even if you are exempt from that sentence that says you do not need to comply with barrier-free requirements of 3.8, you still have to design these items to be accessible. Okay, these are applicable no matter whether or not your floor area is served by a barrier-free path of travel. And to give you a little bit of context in that, I want you to think beyond the person in a wheelchair. Who might also benefit from increased access throughout a building, right? Typically, we often see people, when we say barrier-free design, they automatically assume someone in a wheelchair, but that's not always the case. We have someone who might require the use of a white cane, vision impairment, someone who uses a walker who can, compensate for that single threshold or single stair riser at the entrance door, or maybe even navigate up through an escalator. We have people who maybe broke a leg and use crutches. Sure, they can go up a flight of stairs. Moms with strollers or dads with strollers, or even people with service animals. All of these requirements for limited barrier-free will provide greater access for persons who have limited mobility and do not necessarily use a wheelchair or have a sensory disability. These people can still climb stairs or use escalators and would benefit from having wider doors or lever-style door handles or larger washrooms to allow them and their service animal. Okay, so being mindful that barrier-free requirements if you are not renovating the entrance to your building, the building code is not retroactive. You are not required to renovate that building entrance in order to provide barrier-free access to your suite. And if you don't have barrier-free access to your suite or your building as a whole, then you're not required to design it to be barrier-free accessible, but please consider others who may be benefiting by limited barrier-free access, okay? That covers extensive versus basic renovations. And now let's get into the bulk of our presentation, performance level and compensating construction. Excuse me. So the premise of part 11 is it's an evaluating tool, okay? And it's structured quite simply into two separate sections, 11.4.2 and 11.4.3. 11.4.2 is your evaluating tool. And if you hit any of those checkboxes in 11.4.2, then you have to do compensating construction per 11.4.3. And I really use part 11 as a checklist. I start out in 11.4.2 and I go through check, 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 X, check, X. And if you hit any of those X's, flip the page, go to 11.4.3 and see what you need to do to compensate for those X's. And it's as simple as that. The premise of part 11 is to maintain the existing performance level, or don't adversely affect the building by your construction. In layman's terms, don't make it worse, okay? You're under no obligation, the building code is not retroactive, you're under no obligation to upgrade your building to meet current code. And when I say current code, the code is amended sometimes once a month, every 6 months. It's amended quite often. There's no way our buildings or our building budgets have the means to sustain current code requirements, okay? So all you're obligated to do is if you touch it, make sure you don't make it worse, okay? So getting into this, this is an evaluating tool. So I'm gonna walk you through all the things that need to be evaluated and what compensated construction requirements need to be addressed. So the code breaks it down into 5 categories. This is all we need to evaluate. We don't need to look beyond this. If it's not prescribed by the building code, you are not obligated to look into it. So for example, if you're not touching your exterior windows, spatial separations is not covered under part 11. You're not obligated to go back and look at spatial separations. Okay, if you're just replacing window like for like, that's a basic renovation. You don't need permit. You're good to go. You don't need to evaluate it. Okay. These are the only categories that you need to evaluate: structural systems, occupant load, change in major occupancy, plumbing systems, and sewage systems. That's all you have to look at. And if you affect any of those, then you have to do compensating construction for that. Okay? If it's not on this list, you don't need to worry about it. So let's get into the weeds here. Structural systems. So the criteria, and again, the whole framework of this presentation, evaluation, compensating construction. So under 11.4.2.1, the evaluation for structural systems is to ensure that your structural systems are not adversely affected by a change in major occupancy, an occupant load increase, or a live load increase, okay? To put that into better perspective, we have a building and we have an office floor area and the office tenant moves out and we put in a Zumba class, okay? Well, those people are now jumping on the floor. Is the floor strong enough to hold up that Zumba class? It's an A2, it's a fitness thing, right? Somebody needs to evaluate it. So typically this falls into the wheelhouse of the structural engineer, but they need to evaluate it. And if that floor is not strong enough, they're gonna have to upgrade it. Right? So they have to take remedial measures. So that is a classic example, very straightforward for structural. If you think that your structural systems are going to be affected by your change in major occupancy, or you're adding more people to a space, and it's going to be heavier, or your live load's going to change, then you should engage a structural engineer to evaluate that further and make sure those floor systems are strong enough. Okay. The next topic, next bullet, would be occupant load. What do we mean on occupant load? So our criteria for assessing occupant load is, are we going to increase the occupant load by the building by more than 15%? If we're going to increase it by less than 15%, but more than 15% beyond which is for a fire alarm system or an exit capacity, then that's also deemed affecting the performance level and we have to evaluate it. So these are a bit harder to read, so I'm going to break these apart and get into them a little bit more deeply to clarify here. So speaking to an increase in occupant load by more than 15%. The code gives you a bit of a construction tolerance here in the sense that if you're adding, a few more people to a floor area, you don't have to go back and evaluate it. The codes are built robust enough that they can support an increase. The coding considers an affecting the performance level in an adverse manner if you're more than 15%. So that's your threshold. You're going to increase by more than 15% beyond which the building was designed for. You should evaluate it and see what's needed to support all those extra people. Okay. Now I want you to be mindful of the language here. The 15% is increased beyond the occupant load of the building. It's not specific to a suite. Okay, so if we have an occupant load of a building of 100 people and we increase our occupant load to 115, we're not more than 15%, so we don't need to evaluate it any further. We can just say we're good to go, we don't need compensating construction. But if we increase that occupant load of the building to 116 people, then we have to evaluate it and potentially do some upgrades to our building. Where it gets into the gray zone a little bit is with respect to we're increasing the occupant load of our suite. So we have a 10-story building, we have 10 people per floor area, and we're allowed to go up to, 115 or 116 people. But what if one tenant wants to take all 16 of those people and put them onto their suite? Technically, the requirement of the code is satisfied because we're not increasing the occupant load of the building as a whole, but that suite is getting that benefit of that increase in occupant load. The gray zone comes in to say, are you sure that the neighbor hasn't already done this? What if the guy on level 2 has already upgraded and he's already added 5 people? And then the gentleman up on level 15 or level 9 has added 4 people. So the city reserves the rights to say, prove it. You want to add those 16 people to your floor? Prove that the building hasn't been increased overall by more than 15%. And that may require you to do an occupant load analysis of the entire building. Okay, so just be mindful of that when you are increasing your occupant load because you want to ensure that you aren't affecting other tenants within that space or that those other tenants haven't already affected you. Excuse me. The other requirement for increasing occupant load is increasing beyond that which is required for a fire alarm system. Now, the language of this article is quite specific, and it says where the occupant load of a building is increased by more than 15% beyond the requirements for a fire alarm system. So OBC section 324, it speaks to fire alarm systems. And it speaks to when you would require a fire alarm system. So again, just going through an example here, if we have an existing building occupant load of 299 people, and we propose to increase it to 325. Well, the requirements of 322 state that you need a fire alarm system if your building occupant load is more than 300 people. So by verbatim of the code under part 3, you would need a fire alarm system. But this is a grace that you get under Part 11, and it's saying you can increase 15% beyond that threshold. So you can go 15% beyond the 330 people. So technically, 15% beyond 300 is 345 people. Okay, so as long as you don't go over that 345 people, you don't need to install a fire alarm system. Your occupant load increase is permitted, and you don't need any compensating construction in this regard, because in this scenario, we're only proposing 325. We're staying within that threshold. Okay, so be mindful of that language. That beyond is a key takeaway from this. And that's very similar to how we analyze exit capacity as well. Moving over to exit capacity. Again, same language, beyond, not more than 15% beyond the available exit capacity. Okay, so exit capacity is also determined under Part 3 or Part 9. I forgot to mention this. Part 11 does cover Part 3 or Part 9 buildings. Okay, so you can apply it in either situation. I speak generally when I say Part 3, but the same requirements could be applied to Part 9. So exit capacity, our exits have a certain flow rate that we use to calculate an evacuation time for a building. And we want to ensure that we have a sufficient number of exit facilities, whether they're doors or exit stairs, to get people out of that building in a timely fashion. So if we're going to add more people to a floor area, well, then we might be creating some queuing at our exits, right? Which is going to delay egress. So again, we want to make sure that we have sufficient exit capacity, and it's that 15% beyond. Okay. we often see people limit their occupant load increases based on exit capacity, because exit capacity, sure, we can add another toilet here or there, or, a fire alarm system might be able to be accommodated in a building, but sometimes it's very difficult to put an exit stair in a building. So in that case, we often see people limit the occupant load, and they advise their clients, all right, you can increase, but I suggest you increase only to 15%. You don't want to go beyond that threshold, because that may warrant an additional exit facility be installed into your building. Okay. There are also compliance alternatives on this, but I will speak more to those later. So if we affect any of these, if we've increased our occupant load by more than 15%, we've added more people to our floor, or we've gone beyond those design requirements for a fire alarm system or an exit facility, we've affected the performance level. So we have to do compensating construction. So the compensating construction associated with an increase in occupant load is defined as requiring an evaluation of the early warning and evacuation systems. Okay, this is an actual table right under part 11, and it says go through and analyze this. And it's essentially a checklist, and it just says make sure that you aren't affecting travel distance, that you have enough emergency lighting, and it's a checklist that you have to go through. Exit signs are put in. These typically, in my experience, have been picked up as part of your design fit out for that space, but it's a good little checklist for you to use. So if you are increasing the occupant load of a space, then the building code is going to require that you evaluate the early warning and evacuation systems. I've put a little list there for your benefit. And if any of those are affected by your proposed increase in occupant load, then you will have to do compensating construction. So I'll tune in on that second last bullet, door release hardware. Our previous occupant load was, say, 50 people, and we're increasing it to 125 people. Well, we're going to need panic hardware on our doors now, because we're over 100 people in those suites. Okay, so those are some of the upgrades that might be needed or warranted as part of that increase in occupant load. There are some exceptions to evaluating the early warning and evacuation system. These lead in heavily on the Group C major occupancies, and boarding and rooming houses, or residential applications that have a very minimal small occupant load, like 14 or 10 people. So those are typically the only exceptions to evaluating that. So that is your compensating construction for increase in occupant load. We have to evaluate against that table under OBC 11433. Okay, so you can see we look at it, we assess, we evaluate, and if we affect it in an adverse manner or a negative manner, then we have to do compensating construction. In this one, we don't actually have to do compensating construction, but we have to ensure that all of these systems, like we have exit signs, that our lighting is sufficient, that we have a fire alarm system if we need it, that all these systems are in place. And if they're not, then you do have to implement them. Another compensating construction, and this is only applicable in part 11. I'm not speaking to part 10 here, but other things that have to be evaluated when we're, oh, sorry, did I jump ahead here? I did. Sorry, the next topic that we have to look at when we're evaluating performance level is change in major occupancy. So change in major occupancy, I spoke to it before. The OBC categorizes your occupancy types. So we have like our Group A, our assembly, our Group B is kind of our detention and healthcare facilities. Group C, residential. Group D is our offices and our business suites. E, retail. F, industrial. And G for our kind of greenhouse or farm buildings. If our buildings were designed to whatever category and we're changing those categories, that's what's deemed a change in major occupancy. This is really where we typically will use part 11 to evaluate what the impacts are of that change in major occupancy. But the code does speak to exactly what would be deemed a change in major occupancy. So you don't have to think too strongly on it, because there are certain applications that are a bit unique that you're not quite sure, is that a change in major occupancy? So I'll just read through them here. So performance level would be considered reduced. So our evaluation would hit if any of these are checked, okay? So we would have to do compensating construction if you did any of the following. You changed your major occupancy. That one's pretty clear. A Group D residential suite is subdivided into more than one suite. And we see this a lot. We've got an apartment building that has a pool that's no longer used. And the owner's like, well, rent rates are quite high right now. I could get 3 suites out of this. Let's rip out the pool and we're going to put in 3 suites. That would be considered a change in major occupancy, even though it doesn't really fit the language of the code. but it is affecting the performance level of the building, and you need to do a full evaluation of it and potentially compensated construction. If we're flipping a group A2 or a group A4 into a gaming premises have a lot of specific requirements under the codes. We want you to evaluate those. A farm building is being changed to any major occupancy. Doesn't sound like it happens often, but I'm sure we've all been to a wedding in a barn, right? If it's a one-off, sure, it's still a farm building, it's still a barn. But if they start hosting these more regularly, at what point does this barn become an assembly occupancy, right? We should be evaluating that because that barn was not built to have candles on dining room tables and barbecues and food features, right? Or if a building is changed to a retirement home, that's another risk, right? We see this a lot with aging in place. We have an apartment building and the people age in place and it now becomes a retirement home. So there's specific requirements for that have to be evaluated. Or there's a change in use of a building where the previous major occupancy is not known. But we do see this come up, not too frequently. But if you're not sure, was it an office? Was it a retail space? We're not quite sure what went into this. The code's going to ask that you evaluate it. Okay. So if you check any of these, even though they don't really fit within the language of change in major occupancy per se, you do have to do further evaluation and potentially compensating construction. So let's go look at how we would kind of evaluate that and what the compensating construction is. The code breaks down these requirements into hazard index and construction index. And this is probably what your biggest takeaway will be from this presentation is how we actually figure this out. And I'm going to walk you right through it. So hopefully you'll have some clarity here. This is the table for compensating construction. So it's 11434. Okay. And what it's saying is you have to assess the hazard index of the building. And if you make the hazard increased, then you have to do compensating construction. But it needs to understand what the building is made of to see what upgrades are needed. And this is really in terms of kind of your structural systems, your floor systems. Like, do we need to upgrade our floors, right? And it needs to know, are you a wood frame building? Are you a non-combustible building? All those come into play. Are you sprinklered? So these compensating construction requirements really hang on the construction of the building. And they speak to, okay, well, this new occupancy is quite risky. We're going to want to see sprinkler system be installed in this space. Okay. So these compensating construction requirements, and I'll come back to this table, but these are how we really determine what we evaluate against. So let's get into this. Hazard index. This is the first step. We have to figure out what the hazard index is of our existing building, and we have to evaluate it against the hazard index of our proposed building. So again, going on to that warehouse space, we have to assign a hazard index to the warehouse based on its functions and use. And then we have to evaluate it against a hazard index for our new office space. And if our office space has a higher number, then it's riskier. And we potentially have to do compensating construction. Okay. If our hazard index is less, the code's like, okay, there's no risk there. You're reducing it. It's less risky. We aren't worried about it. Nothing further required. Okay, so you only need to get into this assessment. You have to follow this path only if you affect it and it gets worse. The bigger number is worse. Okay, so let's go through an example here. So say we had a nightclub. It was 2 stories in building height and it has a building area of 400 meters squared. We're going to look, a nightclub is a group A2 major occupancy, and we're going to look to see, okay, what hazard index is required to determine. So this could either be our existing hazard index or this could be our proposed hazard index. So let's say that our existing office, okay, I'll lay this up. Our existing office, it has a hazard index of, let's say 2. Okay, it's a construction combustible building. It has a hazard index of 2. We're converting that office suite into a nightclub. There is a note to every one of these tables. At the end of each of these tables, and these tables are categorized based on their major occupancy. So, chronological in the sense it starts with group A, group B is the next table, group C is the next table, and you go through them. A little trick. If you're never, regardless of whether your building is part 11, if you're unsure of what your major occupancy is of the building, I always go back to these tables to see, oh, the building code considers it this major occupancy, okay? So you can use these tables as a reference point, regardless of whether you're applying part 11, because they give you full descriptors of what each of these occupancies entail. So going back to this analogy, or this example, we have an office suite. It has a hazard index of 2. We're going to put in a nightclub. And in this building that is 2 stories and 400 meters squared, we have to determine what the new hazard index is going to be to see if we're making it worse. So using the notes to the table below under 11211C, plug in your building size, pick the category that you think is best suited for a nightclub in the larger table, and tell me what the hazard index is. Is it a 3, a 4, or a 6? And we're going to put up a poll there. We'll give you a minute to figure this out, and I'll count you down. But we want to see kind of what your thoughts are and what you think this hazard index might be. Give everybody a moment. And we'll give about 10 more seconds. Don't overthink it. I'll give you the answer anyway. Okay, let's get those answers in. 5. Oh, there we go. All right, so we have a hazard index of 4 being the winner at 72%. Thank you everybody for the participation. This is fantastic. So a hazard index of 4. So first of all, we have to determine what our building size is. So we said 2 stories. So in looking at that little table, 400 meters squared, 1 story. Well, we don't fit. We're not a small building because we're over 1 story. Second, 250 meters squared or a 3-story building. Well, we don't hit that, A, because we're over 250 meters squared, and we're not heritage building. This article, or this line, just for your reference, is only applicable to heritage buildings. So even if I was 250 and 2 stories, I still couldn't apply this because I'm not a public heritage building. That would automatically get categorized upwards. 800 meters squared, 2-story. Ding, ding, winner. We are a medium-sized building. Okay, everybody's on the same page as that. Now, this is where the trick falls. What did everybody classify this nightclub as? Some people may have picked dance hall, licensed beverage establishment, licensed club. There's a lot of options here, right? Before you think too deeply, have a glance down the medium column. They are all 4s, right? So you don't need to really categorize it. I probably would have categorized it for benefit of all licensed beverage establishment, but in this case, it doesn't really matter. They are all 4s under a medium. So all we really needed to figure out was it was a medium-sized building, and we can get that classification of 4. Okay, so well done, everybody. You got that one right. So now we know, we went from, going back to our example here, we have a office occupancy, we assigned a hazard index of 2, and now we're making it a 4. We made it worse. It's got more hazard, right? It's a bigger number. So we need to do upgrades to the building to support that occupancy. So let's see here. We need to figure out, and the way the code is structured is, and I'm going to go back here. Let's see if I can go back. Yes. This is the table that we are now applying. But if you look at the categories at the top there, the first column says new major occupancy. So we have our new major occupancy as a 4, okay? Increase your construction index, that's the CI acronym. Increase your construction index to equal the hazard index to support the new major occupancy. So we know our new hazard index is a 4. So we have to increase our construction index of our building to equal a 4. Okay, which means we have to figure out what our construction index is. But let's go do that. So construction index. So this is under OBC table 11211A. And you essentially have to read through this and figure out what is the most conservative application for your existing building. So let's say we have a wood frame building and it is equipped with 30-minute floors and a non-rated roof. The roof is not rated, okay? I would then assign it And floors over basement, we don't have a basement, okay? So we can, conservatively say, well, we don't have a basement, so we can kind of checkbox that. I would assign it a construction index of 3, okay? Because we have that 30-minute floor, we don't have a floor over a basement, so we don't need to worry about that 30-minute threshold, and we have a 0-hour roof. So I would assign the construction index of 3 to this scenario. Hopefully everybody follows that. So now we've got a whole bunch of numbers here. Let's recap. Our existing building hazard index is 2. Our new hazard index is 4. And our construction index for our building is 3. Okay. So going back to this table. I don't think anybody can see my cursor here, but hopefully we can follow down. I am in the 3rd row. It's the only one that speaks to HI4. So hazard index of 4. That's our new new hazard index. And our construction index is 3. So it says construction index of 1, 2, or a 3, and we're increasing it to a hazard index of 4, right? So we need to comply with table 11.2.11a, ratings for a construction index of 4. That's how we upgrade it. So we have to upgrade that construction index that we determined as a 3. We have to upgrade it to be a 4. So a 4 is going to require us to increase our fire resistance rating of our floors and our floors over basement to 45 minutes. Okay, we're still combustible construction. We don't have to upgrade that. So if you can see, we have to upgrade our floor fire resistance rating to support this new major occupancy. That is our compensated construction. And that's within the acceptable solutions of the building code. Now, the code understands that some buildings are a bit more complicated, so it may be a little bit more difficult. So it gives you some options. And these are compliance alternatives here. And it says, for this same example, if you can't upgrade your floors, right? Maybe it's just too difficult to get drywall in there, and we've got too many service lines. You can alternatively provide sprinklers. Okay. Note the language, provide sprinklers in locations where assemblies do not comply. So if you have, your 2-story building and you can upgrade your 2nd floor to be that 45-minute fire resistance rating, then potentially you may only need to sprinkler your ground floor. That's the floor that you can't upgrade. Okay. So this is how we evaluate it. We look at the existing hazard index and the new hazard index. If you increase it, we have to then evaluate that snapshot in time. What does the building have and how are we going to upgrade it? Okay, what compensating construction is needed to support that? I do realize that that's a bit complicated, so I've built you a roadmap. Okay, so you can actually go through all of this. You just follow the arrows, yes or no. You're welcome to take a screenshot of this as a little reference tool, but I do understand that a copy of the presentation will be made available, so you will have this slide. Okay. So that's the pathway to evaluating the performance level with respect to a change in major occupancy. In addition to those, though, there are some other requirements that we do still have to evaluate under a change in major occupancy, okay? So we've assessed the hazard index, and even if we are not affecting the hazard index, we had a 2 and we're keeping it as a 2, even though it's a change of use, we still have to evaluate this, and the code still requires us to evaluate the early warning and evacuation systems. It's going to look at tenant-to-tenant fire separations, okay? So, if we had 2 office suites that previously did not require a fire-rated demising wall between them, and we're flipping one of those office suites to be a retail tenant, there are requirements under the building code that those tenant suites have to be separated from each other. So you may have to upgrade that existing demising wall, okay? That's one of the evaluators here. And the construction of the building will change to a group C occupancy in a building that's over 3 stories in height. So we really want to protect those residents who are sleeping that are at higher risk during an emergency potentially. So we want to make sure we look at it, and this is particular to those requirements under 3244 for those kind of mid-rise combustible construction buildings. Okay. And what do we need to do? Compensate if we are affecting any of these? Well, in that demising wall situation, if that demising wall was not protected with a fire-rated assembly, we may have to upgrade it for that tenant-to-tenant safety mechanism between the 2. Another option is we may have to actually sprinkler a portion of the building to affect the space that's being changed. Okay. So there is compensated construction requirements associated with these if you are evaluating them and determining that you are impacting them in an adverse manner. Another requirement of the code that we have to evaluate if we're renovating a building and we're having a change in major occupancy, or we're increasing the occupant load, is we have to make sure that we have enough toilets to support that new major occupancy, right? Oftentimes in kind of our office suites, we're, making our office suite more dense and we're leaning on kind of washrooms that are in the core being used by multiple tenants. So we want to ensure that we have sufficient number of toilets within our suite or access to people from our suite so that we can support those new occupant loads, okay? So the criteria here for evaluating whether you need additional toilets is if the plumbing system in the existing building is adversely affected by your renovation. If you're going to increase your occupant load, right? Clearly, you're going to have to make sure that you have enough toilets to support those new people. If we're adding bedrooms to a dwelling unit, we're adding people to our dwelling unit. And if we have a change in major occupancy, that's going to affect our sanitary. So these are requirements that, we will have to look at under Part 11, and obviously compensating construction, put more toilets in. It's pretty straightforward. In terms of how many toilets you need to apply, and lavatories, I should say, I should include those, you will fall back to Part 3 or Part 9, okay? So any new construction is still governed by Part 3 and Part 9. So if you're putting in new toilets, the capacity of those toilets will be derived from those other parts, just like you would if it was a brand new building construction, okay? Now, if we're putting in new toilets, we have to make sure that our sewage systems for our building can accommodate all these extra toilets. So that's another key feature that we want to look at. This typically falls into your mechanical, their wheelhouse, but you want to make sure that you don't just add toilets and that your sewage systems and pipes can accommodate all those additional facilities. So that's going to push you back to Part 7 requirements. So that's assessing the performance level and compensating construction requirements. Like I said, the building code is structured 1142 evaluating. And if you hit any of those requirements, if you're affecting them in any adverse manner, then you have to do compensating construction. So it says if you're affecting the occupant load under 1142, turn the page. You turn the page to 1143 and it says, oh, you affected the occupant load under sentence 1142 number. Then this is what you have to do. And that's really how Part 11 reads, okay? It is pretty straightforward. Use it as an actual checklist, mark it up, checkbox X, checkbox X, and then you cross it over and there's all cross references between. So it's saying if you affect it, then you have to do this per this, and it gives you that code reference to follow, okay? Grandfathering. Compliance alternatives. So the building code does recognize that some of our buildings were built a long time ago, potentially not even under a building code. The first edition of the National Building Code came out in 1940. It was adopted based on an amalgamation of a lot of municipal bylaws so that all the jurisdictions could align on some of the prescriptive requirements and acceptable solutions. So a lot of these buildings that we're working on are over 100 years old and, don't necessarily fit the language of the building code today. For example, all of our schools were built in the 70s. All of our schools are unsprinklered, right? Well, we're going to go put an addition on a school. How do we build it? Right? We have to build it per part of the requirements of the building code, but the building code doesn't require us to even touch that existing building. So potentially we could go through and sprinkler just the new addition, but not retroactively have to sprinkler the existing. Maybe the new addition is non-combustible construction, while the existing building is combustible. Just note that there's a lot of little code quirks, such as non-combustible construction can't be supported by combustible construction. So you have to kind of think through all of those requirements. But the code does recognize that some situations don't quite fit. And it's not your scope or your mandate to fix them. Sometimes it's just too difficult. So I've given some examples here of some compliance alternatives that I'll get into, but to provide a bit more clarity on this. But note that if you are using a compliance alternative for parts 3, 4, 6, or 8, you need to have approval for it. So it's not a guarantee that the city is going to accept this grandfathering, okay? But if you're doing it under Part 9 or Part 12, you don't need approval from the city, okay? You will sometimes get notification from the city who say, I know you don't have to do this, but we would really suggest that you do so. And I'll give you an example here. You're retiling a washroom. So you're taking all the tile off the washroom. That washroom is a barrier-free stall. That barrier-free stall has a diagonal grab bar. You are under no obligation to put in the current L-shaped grabbed bar. You can put that diagonal grab bar, you can take it off, retile the wall, and put that diagonal back on. Again, the building code recognizes maybe you don't have budget to go buy all new L-shaped grab bars, right? But you will still get that cautionary note back from the city who says, okay, I know that you can put that diagonal grab bar back up, but we would recommend, now that you've taken the tiling off and you've exposed kind of the reinforcement in the wall, this is your opportunity to make it right. Okay, so you'll always get that, but be cautious of the language. We recommend is very different than we require. Okay, but that being said, to apply these compliance alternatives, the city wants to have a weigh-in because they have to assess the level of risk. Yeah, they understand that this building is deemed not safe for whatever reason. And maybe it's things like headroom clearance, right? Maybe you don't have sufficient headroom clearance throughout a space. Well, you can't exactly, underpin the 10th floor, right? Like, or increase your floor heights, right? There's certain difficulties that we achieve there. But the city wants to have eyes on it because it's up to them to decide, do you actually have opportunity to make this right? Or are you just trying to cut a corner? We're going to assume you're not going to cut a corner, but they need to have eyes on it. So that's why the city wants to have weigh-in on parts 3, 4, 6, or 8 if you're going to apply a compliance alternative. As common structure for part 11, it's always kind of split up into separate tables. The compliance alternatives correlate the numbering system, correlate to the occupancy classification. So I've given 3 examples here. I've got an example under DE 39, A53, and C46. DE correlates to a group D or a group D major occupancy. So we've got a business or office occupancy, and we've got a retail, DE. A53 can only be applied to assembly. C46, that's derived from the residential tables, right? It's group C. So just be mindful that your compliance alternatives are specific to your major occupancy. So make sure you use the right table. For example, travel distance may not be acceptable under a different occupancy classification. It may only be acceptable in a group D or a group E example, okay? And in this case, it says, all right, you know what? Sure, you have 50-meter travel distances throughout your office space. We're not going to make you drop in a new stair to correct that existing travel distance deficiency. The only mandate is that the building be sprinklered, okay? And that you don't make it worse. So do you remember when I spoke to putting up that little non-load bearing partition before? As long as you maintain that 50-meter travel distance or whatever number it was existing, you are not obligated to kind of remove walls, move everything around to give a better line of sight to reduce that down to 45 meters. You can keep that 50 meters. Just don't put walls in the way so that it extends to a 52-meter travel distance or a 55-meter travel distance. That's where the city is going to want to make sure that you're not making it worse. You just maintain, okay? And it will accept extended travel distances in certain applications. Door swings in assembly building. Again, maybe you don't have budget to go and reverse all the doors in their frames. So it's saying in this circumstance, if it's a public heritage building, for any of you who have worked on a lot of our municipal buildings, around the city of Toronto here or Ottawa, we've got a lot of heritage facilities and we've got those big wooden doors and we don't want to be reversing swing. And maybe back in the day, our old codes didn't require doors to swing outwards when we had more than 60 people. So it's saying that in an existing building for public heritage, sure, you do not need to reverse the swing of those doors, provided you don't make it worse. Don't put more people in that room. It's already a risk that the door swings inwards. Let's not make it worse, okay? These are, I hope, common sense to you, but yeah, use your judgment on these, but this is here to recognize that some of these things cannot be accommodated in your renovation. And headroom, like I spoke to before, there's always a baseline. We don't want people squatting to walk through a space. 1980 is your minimum, but you're not obligated to, reroute some piping that may run through your tenant suite if it's, kind of a base building element and it's not within your scope of your project. So all these compliance alternatives can be applied. These are your grandfathering clauses, okay? But note that you have to indicate these on your OBC matrix so that the city can then evaluate whether or not they're acceptable, at least in a Part 3 application. If you're a Part 9 building, the city has less risk. These are smaller buildings, so there's less concern, and you can just apply these as of right without actually having to get approval for application of these compliance alternatives, okay? There are also code references directly in here. So when it says existing travel distances acceptable, it says existing travel distances as required under OBC 3425 or whatever the code reference may be. It gives you that actual cross-reference for you. Okay. Okay, we are getting close to the end here. I have put in a part 11 matrix. Just to be clear, I want to kind of just go through some key things that I'm looking for in an OBC matrix. So first off, I see countless times a renovation project that puts a part 3 matrix on the drawing set. That should not be on the drawing side. Less is more when you're giving information to the city. The city does not require a part 3 matrix. It's great if you want to provide it, but it gives them chance to comment on it. All you're obligated to provide is the part 11 matrix. And hopefully, now that you've participated in this presentation, you'll be able to fill this out, okay? But the part 11 matrix is the one that goes on your drawings. I would suggest that if you're doing a building addition where you've got, has to conform to all of the parts, maybe you want to include the part 3 matrix as specific to that renovation or to that addition on your drawing as well. But the primary focus should be the part 11 matrix for any existing building, okay? If it's existing and it's more than 5 years, use a part 11 matrix. The other thing I want to really draw your attention to is the OREG, and I put it in red there. This is critical because we often lean on grandfathering these buildings, but we have to know that when your design was applied for permit, because we oftentimes have to go back and look at old codes to see how was this building designed, because the mandate of part 11 is don't make it worse. So if that building was designed with Swiss cheese floors, okay, we'll keep it as Swiss cheese floors, but I don't make it worse. But I need to know what were the limiters for that design. And in order to do so, I have to go back to the building code that was enforced at the time of building permit submission. What was it designed to? So that OREG is quite critical. So always, people often just leave it as whatever the boilerplate template form has, but please upgrade that to whatever the current OREG is for everyone's benefit. It is OREG 16324, and that is the 2024 building code right now. And our current amendment is under OREG 5/25. We've had that one since January, so we're probably due for another one soon. But going through, all you're doing is essentially everything that I've done in this presentation. You're going to go through and fill out these boxes to the best of your capabilities. I will say that these matrices are general. They are intended to apply to all buildings, but your responsibility is really just to get this information to the city for them to make a judgment on whether they think your design is safe. So if you need to manipulate these boxes to suit your project, for example, occupant load, I believe the boilerplate template from the OAA website is all individual lines on floor areas. Well, what if you're a single story building? Or what if your building you're looking at as a whole? Then you can certainly put a box over the entire cell here and, just to relay that information and put it into sentence structure. I'm a code consultant. I like my sentences. But feel free to add content to this that's going to provide clarity to the city. You can manipulate it. It's strictly a summary form for the benefit of the city. However you can get that information to them is best. And then just going through, it's just checkboxing. Are you affecting these? Exactly like I structured this presentation. Are you affecting it in a diverse manner? Any X's on that evaluating tool? You put those on the matrix. If you're affecting it, are you doing compensating construction? Yes, no. Are your hazard indexes the same? Then you don't need to do compensating construction, okay? Note under 11.15, there's that compliance alternative proposed. This is where you're going to list those, that DE compliance alternative for travel distances. You have to indicate that so that you draw the city's attention that, hey, there's existing travel distances in this building, and we're going to make sure that they're maintained and we're not going to make them worse. And it draws our attention to them, but you have to inform them that you're applying that alternative or that compliance alternative. Okay. Now, question for you all. I was wondering, we could potentially do another webinar where we actually go through and do a full, let's fill this out. And we could do a part 3 and we could do a part 11, and we could actually kind of expand on this presentation and do a part 3 one where we go through and we actually complete this. And I go through, would we increase the occupant load? Where do we put the checkbox here? What should we say here? And give examples and maybe use a project as an example in completing this. And we wanted to take a poll to see if anybody would be interested in a webinar where we actually complete a part 3 and a part 11 OBC matrix. So that'll help you kind of moving forward with your project. So we're going to put up a poll just to see if there's any interest in having a separate webinar on completing an OBC matrix. So we'll give everybody about 10 seconds here to fill that out. Again, this is just for future webinar purposes, just to see. Yes, wow, 97%. Okay, I'm glad I asked. Okay, well then I will tell Ashley and Claire to maybe schedule a webinar for us to go through that. And yeah, we'll make it more of a workshop type. So stay tuned for that, and we'll get our ducks in a row to get that underway. And now that concludes my presentation. It's a lot of content. Hopefully everybody got the premise of it or a little bit more clarity. Now that when you open up your part 11, hopefully there'll be a few light bulbs there that'll make it a little bit easier to read. So thank you all. I appreciate your time today, and let's open it up for questions here. Let's see if I...
Yes, thanks so much, Megan. We'll definitely make a note of the next webinar. So everyone on the call, keep your eyes peeled. There's a bunch of questions already in. Are you seeing them there, Megan?
I am. Yes,
Okay,
I am seeing them, Claire. So I will jump in and try and go through these. How many? Well, we don't have too many. Okay. Usually what I find is when I start with these, it triggers a whole bunch of other questions. So keep typing your questions, everyone. We have, I think 12:30 was our hard stop. So we've got 25 minutes to go through these. So feel free, if you get inspired by some of these questions, to add yours to the bottom, and we'll just keep going until that time runs out here. So thank you, Claire. Okay. So, open questions. So first question, when adding a story to an existing bungalow. Okay, not quite sure what the question is there, but I'm going to guess at it. Harris, if you want to elaborate if I get this wrong, please add to the bottom and I'll come back to it. But when adding a story to an existing bungalow. So again, the existing bungalow would be governed by part 11. You don't have to do any upgrades to part 11, or sorry, to the existing bungalow. But that new story, well, how are you going to build it? You need to know how to build it, right? So we're going to be looking to the other requirements of the code. So as a bungalow, I'm going to assume it's being governed by OBC Part 9, right? Smaller building. So you would look to Part 9 and you would design it as a Part 9 building. So if we're adding a story to it, if it's a single story bungalow, we're adding a story, we're going to design this as a 2-story building, and all the construction requirements that are inherent for that 2-story building, residential building, we're going to apply to the new addition. But that doesn't mean we have to upgrade the existing bungalow. That can remain as is. The only time, like I said before, we would have to kind of look at that, whereas if we had that scenario where we had an existing wood frame building and say it's a certain number of stories, but if we add more stories to the building, it now requires non-combustible construction, right? Then we can't have non-combustible construction supported by combustible construction. So that would be one that would actually impact the existing building. So hopefully, Harris, I answered that question for you. Moving on for the next one. For barrier-free, the 300 square meter applies to residentials also. Yes, the 300 meter squared applies to everything in the sense of it's your suite size. So a suite could also be considered a dwelling unit. So yes, that 300 meter squared limit could be directly to that residential suite. Another question. Oh, Harris, this is another one to add on. When adding a second story to an existing bungalow, do unprotected openings on level 1 need to be removed? And how can windows be installed on the face of a house close to a property line where unprotected openings are also not allowed? Oh, we're getting into the project specifics here. Okay, so what you have to look at is we're speaking to windows and our spatial separation requirements here. So if we have a house and it has a certain number of windows, let's just say the north side. So on the north side, we have a front door and 2 windows existing on the bungalow. And we're putting a second story on that building and we're going to add windows. Well, we can only add windows if we're allowed to. Maybe we've hit our limit with that ground floor, right? So we have to do our spatial separations on the whole building face. Okay, the only time we can actually compartmentalize is if we have that 45-minute fire separation between. Part 9 does give us a few other allowances, so I'm speaking generically here, or a few exceptions to that rule for that 45-minute floor assembly. But essentially, we do have to look at that building as a whole, because we want to ensure that if we're using 100% of our exposing building face allocated for openings on the ground floor, then we may not be allowed to have windows on the second floor. So we have to look at it as a whole. But by adding area to our exposing building face, we should be able to add 1 or 2 windows depending on our proximity to our property line. Okay. Next question, is it C1, 3, or 2? So this is with the construction index into our analogy. Let's see if I can jump back to presentation slide where we did construction index. Okay, so construction index. So the difference between combustible for construction index 2 versus a 3, if you look at those and you do a comparison to them, it would be the floors over the basement, right? So 30-minute floor over a basement would allow you to have a construction index of 3, but if you didn't have a rated floor over your basement, then it would be a 0 hour. In the analogy that I gave, we don't have a basement, okay? So we shouldn't be faulted for not having a basement. So we would consider no basement as equivalent to a 30-minute basement. Okay, so I would give you that. Hopefully that makes sense. So I would apply a construction index of 3 to this situation because we don't have a basement in that sense. So there's no risk of a fire below burning upwards to affect people on the first floor, right? It's kind of analogous to that. So that would be the construction index we would apply to the example. Next question, if a roof system is replaced for maintenance reasons only, does the roof insulation need to comply with SB 10? Oh, great question. Okay. If you're only replacing the roof, like the roof tile, say, then that would be considered a basic renovation, right? We're not taking the whole roof off and affecting the structural system and all the insulation and such. So technically you could say, no, the existing roof insulation is going to remain. But if you're taking the insulation out, and you're putting in new insulation, well, then the new insulation has to meet current code. Okay, so it would have to comply with SB 10. But if you're leaving the existing insulation, then you're under no obligation to upgrade it. The building code is not retroactive. So you could take that roof tile off and just put new roof tile on, and you're not obligated to meet SB 10. I'll give you an example of one of the projects that I had. I won't speak to the jurisdiction in Ontario, but I had a project where we had a retail suite above, a residential suite above a small retail store. So think of like your convenience store applications with a little apartment above. The apartment was getting a lot of noise from the convenience store traffic and from the traffic from the road. Because it was an older building, it probably had newspaper for insulation. So the architect had proposed, I hope you're not on the call, but the architect had proposed, because this is not a happy ending, the architect had proposed that we were just going to upgrade kind of some of the interior wall systems within this residential suite, and we're gonna, put in proper insulation just to increase it. We didn't have to. They just did it for noise purposes, right? And we were touching, I think, only 2 walls out of the 4 walls that formed the perimeter of this residential unit. Well, the city came back and said, well, all that new insulation has to meet current code. And you have to do energy modeling. And I mean, the scope of this project was quite small. So, budget-wise, we didn't have the budget to do this kind of energy modeling to see if it would all comply with SB 10. And I'm not an expert in SB 10. I can only speak to the language of the code and how it's written, and whether is SB 10 even in Part 11? No, it is not. Remember what I said? You only have those 5 things you need to evaluate: structural, occupant load, plumbing, and sewage, and change of major occupancy. That's all you have to look at, right? You don't have to look at the energy efficiency of a building and upgrade it. It's not a hit. So my first question is to the city, where in the building code does it say I have to look at it and upgrade it? And it's not in the building code. Building code is only applicable to new construction. So if we're touching that insulation, then we have to comply with current code. But anyway, back to my example. So we had this residential unit, and the city asked for all this energy modeling, and I wrote countless letters to say, but we're not obligated to upgrade this. So I don't think the intention of the building code ever is to maintain something that's worse. And we don't want to prevent people from, doing good things that are going to increase, the user's experience or not affecting life safety. So if you're going to impose all this energy modeling on the client, you know what they're going to say? all right, sorry, guy, you're gonna have to listen to all the noise of the traffic. You're stuck with your newspaper installation. We're not doing anything because we're not gonna get into all the SB 10 and energy modeling. We don't have budget for that. And I don't feel that's the intention of the building code, to actually force people to go down those avenues. But unfortunately for this project, that's where the city dug in deep. And they did say, well, if you're gonna build that new wall system, because they considered it a new wall system, the minute that that interior drywall came off and that insulation was removed, then it has to meet current code. Even though ironically, the rest of the building, right? Actually, we were only doing the front face of the building. So 3 walls were remaining, front face of the building. So they were saying the front face had to be upgraded to current code because we were touching it. But the other 3 walls, they all remained. We're not touching them. Part 11 doesn't mandate that we need to touch them. So they were staying. They had the worst performance ever. So we would have this excellent functioning wall at the front, but the 3 other walls were terrible. So the city was like, well, every time you touch a wall, you have to make it better. So that's where they kind of hung their hats on, and they made us upgrade that front wall. The client at the end of the day decided to just leave it, which again, like I said, is, counter to what I believe is the intention of the code. But it is a fine line. But in this situation, for your question, sorry, that was a bit of segue. If you are just taking the roof tile off and you leave the insulation, you're under no obligation to comply with SB 10. There is nothing in the code that directs you to comply with SB 10 if you're not touching it. Okay, so the pushback is always, show me where in the code it says I have to upgrade it, because it's not written there. Okay. Next question. What date is the 5-year mark from? Great question. First partial occupancy, final occupancy. Oh, that is a really good building that has been in existence for at least 5 years. I would say from occupancy permit. Don't quote me on that. That is just my guess. I don't think it's intended. Typically, everything in the building code applies to the date that you apply for building code. We all just went through this enactment of the new building code. When did it come into effect? What projects did it affect? And it affected those that were applied for permit. Everything goes to your kind of building permit date. But I think that the intention here is not for building permit date, because some buildings take longer than 5 years to construct. So I would say and partial occupancy, I would say from like first occupancy. So if are going for a partial occupancy, that's your trigger date, okay? Because you have people in the building, right? So then you're using that space. The city could come back and say, okay, you've got partial occupancy on your lower floors. You've designed your upper floors as kind of just swing space for future fit out. You design them as office. But if you never had occupancy in that space, you never had a D in that space, and now you want to make it retail. And the building is, this space has never been used for D. So it is a bit of a gray zone in that sense. And it's going to depend on what your city plans examiner determines, but it could in some circumstances be your first occupancy, or it could be your kind of tenant fit out if there was no previous occupancy in that space before. So I think it's driven more on occupancy permit than based on your building permit application date. Okay. Next question. At the end of the data matrix, what are the alternative solutions for? Great question. So sometimes we'll have alternative solutions, because be mindful that under Part 11, you could still be doing construction, right? Let's speak to one that's hopefully rings true for some people. We have a certain code change that no longer allows for open stairs, right? Interconnected floor spaces. We're not allowed to have open stairs. We can have open escalators and moving walkways, but no more open stairs. So maybe someone's written an alternative solution as part of your kind of tenant fit out space to allow for an open stair, right? So remember, under Part 11, you could still be doing construction, and you may still have to write an alternative solution. An alternative solution may be to not provide a barrier-free path of travel to a certain room because, the use of the space doesn't afford that. Like if you have a commercial kitchen per se, and, someone in a wheelchair could have access into that space, but they don't have the physical capabilities to actually operate any of the equipment. Perhaps they want to write an alternative solution to say, we're not going to provide a barrier-free path of travel into this space. Those people will be accommodated elsewhere. So things like that. So we always want to have that kind of line item on our OBC matrix to pick those up in case there's any kind of deviations from the acceptable solutions in the building code for these renovation projects, because these renovation projects will still have some potentially construction in them. Next question. Could you explain how you determine the construction index for the example in the presentation? The floors of our basement seem to confuse the selection project. Okay, so this question came in at 12:05. Hopefully I've answered that. Like I said, I draw an analogy on that between the construction index of 2 versus 3 on the idea that a slab on grade is considered equivalent to having a 30-minute floor. The risk is that always fire from below. So if I have a basement, I want to ensure that my basement doesn't affect the integrity of my ground floor. I don't want my ground floor collapsing with the people on the first floor not being aware of it, right? So a 30-minute fire resistance rating, in my opinion, is considered equivalent to a slab on grade, right? Neither circumstance will allow that collapse of that floor assembly within 30 minutes. So that's why I would apply the less conservative requirement of construction index of 3. Okay. Next question, can I explain the OREG part? Absolutely. So OREG, sorry, we love our acronyms as much as you guys love your acronyms for your projects. OREG stands for Ontario Regulation. So Ontario Regulation is enacted as a law to under the Building Code Act on what is the document that is enforced. Okay, so our previous Ontario Building Code looks like this. 2012. This was the original OREG was 332-12. You'll see that written. So this document is OREG, Ontario Regulation 332/12, 2012/12. Okay, so that is your OREG, Ontario Regulation, OREG 332/12, authored this book. Okay, so that is the edition of this book, 332/12. We then came out with a new building code. The new building code was written and it is 163/24. Okay, that is the Ontario regulation to support the new building code. However, from 2012 to 2024, there's been a few code changes, right? The code has had to be updated. For those of you that have a bit more experience, you may recall in 2015, we brought in a lot of barrier-free requirements under an OREG. So under that OREG, that is considered an amendment. So all of the amendments are laws and they have a corresponding Ontario regulations. We assign a number to it, okay? So our current OREG, our 163/24 edition of the building code has been amended 3 or 4 times, I think, since it was first published or first enforced. So the current OREG of this new edition of the building code is 5/25, and that gives us a point in time. And if you go to, for example, if you go to the Ontario website, ontario.ca e-laws, I know we don't have the published version of the building code up currently. They removed that under the 2024 edition, but you can go back and look, and it'll always say OREG, and it has a corresponding date. So it may say OREG 89-12 or 89-19, I think it is, was the 2019 amendment, but it gives you a date frame. So it'll say this version of the building code, this edition, this updated version of the 2012 was effective, and maybe it'll say March 1st, 2019 till August 1st, 2019. And then the next OREG will say from August 2nd to maybe January 2020. This OREG came into play. So what those OREGs are telling you is which version of the building code was applicable at that time. So if you applied for a permit in that March 1st to August window, that would be the building code that was in effect at that time. Okay, and you're going to see that on a lot of your projects because some of your buildings have been designed under the 2012 building code, which has a different OREG, and some of them have been designed under the 2024. So if I was brought in on any of your projects, the first thing I'm going to ask you is, when did you apply for permit? Because that shows what effective date it is, because I need to know, am I reviewing your project against that? Which code am I reviewing your projects against for compliance? Because the codes change over time, right? And you're only obligated to meet the building code that was in effect at the time of permit application. Okay, well, hopefully that explains the OREG part. Oh, I like our bungalow analogy here. This gives me food for my next presentation. Okay. When adding a second story to an existing bungalow, oh, sorry, I already, Harris, you repeated that question. How can windows be installed on the face of the house close to the property line where unprotected openings are not allowed? Sorry, I didn't fully answer that for you. So when you're determining your spatial separation, and this is outside the boundaries of our presentation today, but I'll give you a little free one here. When you're determining your spatial separations, the proximity of your property line is going to determine how many unprotected openings we're allowed, how much plain glazing we're allowed. If you're too close to your property line, there's a risk that those windows, if you have a fire in your building, those windows are going to blow out and they're going to put your neighbor at risk. So we want to protect against that. The farther you are from your property line, the less risk, the more windows you can have. So the code gives you an allowance of how much percent or how much unprotected openings you can have. How many plain openings? You don't need a fire rated door, plain glass, and it does it in a percentage. So percentage of your building face. So you look at your whole building face and a certain percentage of that can be unprotected, 10%, 50%, what have you. And if it's 50%, half your window's glass, half your window's wall, or sorry, half your wall is glass, half your wall is say brick. And so if you're too close to your property line and you're not allowed to have unprotected openings, well, then you have to protect your openings. Simple as that. You're not allowed to have plain glass. You're not allowed to have any openings that are going to put your neighbor at risk. So you have to protect them. And so there's certain requirements you can protect with a, certain circumstances, a sprinkler protected glazed wall assembly. You can put a fire protecting door on there, wire glass, glass block. There's limits if you're even closer to your property line. 1.2 meters is the threshold. If you're too close, it won't even allow you to have wire glass, glass block. Fire shutters are another option, but we have to protect. Okay, so we want to ensure that there's a fire in our building. It's not going to use the window to escape and expose our neighbor. So we're going to have a protected opening. And what are you going to do to protect it? It has to be a life safety system so it can withstand the radiating effects of fire and smoke so that it doesn't create that exposure risk. Okay. Great question, Wayne. Doing convention center, can I raise the occupant load by 14% once occupancy is complete? Okay, well, doing a convention center, first trigger, your building's less than 5 years old. Can I raise the occupant load by 14% once occupancy complete? Well, you can't apply Part 11. Your building is under construction, you're less than 5 years old, so you will have to do an amended permit and the city's going to make you upgrade your building to support those extra people. Okay, so it's straight out of Part 3 and you have to design your building to support those 14 extra people. So if you need to put more toilets in to capture those 14% more, then you need to put more toilets in. However, if you're willing to wait 5 years, right, until that building has been in existence, you've got this convention center, 5 years down the road, you can increase your occupant load by 14%, sure. And if you remember, it's beyond, right? So if you increase it, so not only can you go 14%, you can go 15%. So you can add 15% to that convention center occupant load. And are you affecting the performance level? No, because you're not going beyond. So do you need to do compensated construction? No, you don't need to turn the page. You didn't affect it in a negative manner. You capped it at 15%. You didn't go to 16. Okay, so watch that beyond word. Okay, we have 4 minutes here. Let's see what we can do here. Got some very specific questions here. For a high-rise 6 stories or more, AHJ has the right to enforce stair pressurization or not, right? Even though required in new construction, it can be waived on the concept of keeping it in the same standards. This is a deep question. I'm going to have to table this because there's a lot of things that have to be teased out for that. And for the sake of this presentation, we only have 4 minutes, and this is very project specific. This AHJ cannot enforce pressurized stairs, I can say that, unless you're affecting the stairs by your performance level. Go through your Part 11 evaluation, and if you're affecting the building, then you'll have to do upgrades to those exits. But there's nothing in the building code that says you have to pressurize your stairs. Okay, there are requirements under the early warning and evacuation that says you have to look at the high building requirements. And the only circumstance I could say is if you have an existing, building, it's 6 stories and it was not a high rise and you're now making it a high rise, well then, your stairs may have to require upgrading in the existing component to support those high rise measures, right? Because you're affecting them. You've made this building a high building when it wasn't previously. So now you've got things such as stack effect that weren't previously considered in the design of the building that now will impact that. Okay. Next question, does the OFC override the current OBC? So keep in mind, these are separate documents with separate applications. So you don't worry about the OFC until your building is occupied. It doesn't even come into play, okay? It's your maintenance document. So your obligation when you're designing it until you hand over the keys, you design to the building code and you meet the building code. And if you meet the building code, the OFC should have no way in, okay? The OFC is only intended to enforce that building stay as you designed it, okay? So I can't speak to it OFC overriding the OBC because they come into play at different times in the lifespan of the building. The OBC defines your construction. It's how you build it. And then the OFC ensures. So you have designed this building to have 1-hour walls all the way through it. Now, if the owner comes along and rips down all those 1-hour walls and puts up 45-minute walls, no, that's not safe. Or is it? Did they evaluate it? The OFC is going to force them to evaluate and say, wait a minute, are those 45-minute walls enough? Because this building has been designed with 1 hour. We need to maintain 1 hour. Prove to me that those 1 hour are not needed. And if you can prove to me they're not needed, then we'll accept it. But you have to prove to them because you have to maintain how it was designed. And this is why we need to know what that OREG was on your OBC matrix, because we'll be going back and being like, well, how was it designed? Was it designed with 1-hour walls or 45-minute walls? I need to know how it was designed per that edition of the building code at that time to make sure that we maintain. Okay. Next
Right,
question.
Megan, I'm just looking at the time. Maybe we can just have one more question and then
Yep.
we'll wrap it up.
Perfect. Okay. Yeah. If a washroom is removed, but the plumbing requirements are still met, is that considered a reduction in plumbing? You would have to do an evaluation. So a washroom being removed, you would, if I were the city, like devil's advocate, I would say, prove to me that that washroom's not required. You're taking a toilet away. Show me that nobody's dependent on it. Give me an occupant load analysis, okay? Because we always assume that every toilet is required. So you would have to prove otherwise. I wouldn't say it's a reduction. I would say it's a reduction in plumbing because you had a certain number of facilities. You had 10 and now you only have 9. So, yeah, you would have to demonstrate to the city that you're not making it worse.
Sorry to stop you before. I know we have a couple more questions, and I'm very sorry to those of you who asked questions. This is the to be continued, so please sign up in the fall. Yeah, so much good content and so much engagement in this session, but sadly, we do have to end our presentation there. I just have a few quick announcements to make before everybody signs off. I just want to remind everybody, we do actually have 2 webinars next week. There's one on Tuesday. We don't normally do webinars on Tuesday, but we have one, Building Trust, a Practical Approach to Conflict Resolution, for anybody on the call today who was at Will Goldblum's webinar in the spring. He's coming back for another presentation. I also wanted to remind everybody we do have a summer sale, which is a new thing for the OAA. It's our first time. We're running a promotion for the next 4 webinars for 20% off. So if you didn't already know that, it's a great time. It's a time limited offer. So do sign up. I know we're in our 2nd year of Con Ed, so if you need your structured hours, this is a really good opportunity. It doesn't come along every day. So please sign up after this call. We will, again, upload, for those of you who attended 80% of this webinar today, those hours will be uploaded to your transcript. Just have some patience with us while we do that. And we will be sending the presentation file. And of course, we will always send you a link for feedback. So please complete the survey. Anything else that you want Megan to present on, she's popular for a reason. She's got so much great information. So do take the time to let us know and let Megan know as well. So thank you, everybody. Thank you so much, Megan, for
Thank you.
your knowledge. We greatly appreciate it. And everybody have a wonderful day. Bye.
Thank you, everyone.